This is a very low-tech presentation. I'm just going to read and make comment here and there. There's no PowerPoints, no music examples, no visual. So you may fall asleep doing this. And also, I'm really not an expert in the 19th century. My world goes back a bit earlier. My poets, by the way, are the mid 17th century poets, and a lot was cooking in Istanbul in the mid and later 17th century, both in poetry and music. And I hope to, if I live long enough, to make that clearer. My book, From Rumi to the Whirling Dervishes, I just received the proofs yesterday. So they'd like me to send them back in the next month, and inshallah, there'll be a book coming out in Edinburgh University Press. So what I say here about intercommunal musical geographies and competing modernities, later Ottoman Istanbul, is this, by the way, do you hear me well enough? I'm not speaking too fast? Okay, I may stop for a moment. When I speak publicly like this, I have to remember that my mother's family are Canadians. And in Canada, we speak much more slowly than the Americans. Unfortunately, I've learned the American style. I didn't speak that way when I was younger, but I've become more of an American. So I have to control myself. Now, and also I apologize, I'll be stepping on the toes of several of the researchers here who actually know the sources a lot better than I do for the 19th century. But be that as it may, I will say that modernity is hardly the most scientific of terms. In history, it is commonly employed as a simple contrast to tradition or to any non-Western practices. In the study of the Middle East, modernity is often used as an unthinking reflex, standing in for any era in which Western Europe began to assume a dominant cultural and often economic and then political role. It should be evident that the relations between the Ottoman Empire and Western Europe did not fall into such simple dichotomies in any historical period. In the 1990s, Rifa'at Abou-El-Haj employed the term a locally generated modernity for a process that began in the later 17th century, continued through the 18th century, rather, and partly conflicted with attempts to modernize Ottoman society along Western European lines in the 19th century. This view has been gaining wide acceptance among the new generation of Ottoman historians, such as Christine Filiu, Vaki Tezcan, and Edhem Erdem. Athanasios Angelou, as you know, of the University of Ioannina, had characterized the Ottoman 18th century as a period that was never allowed to reach its full fruition, that was never consummated. It was an age full of potential of newness. I would say that by approaching these local changes within the context of Ottoman Muslim and Eastern Orthodox societies as an alternative form of modernity, we can acquire a powerful means to understand the potentials within these societies. The modernity of the long 18th century was both a top-down and a more spontaneous movement of both Muslim and Eastern Orthodox elites to reorganize many social relations in order to be more effective internally. This would also allow the Christians and the Jews to act as intermediaries between the West and the Muslims. The new modernity of the 19th century, however, was a reaction on the part of the Muslim elites to adapt to the increasing dominance of Western European polities and economies, simply to survive. The musical and social materials employed within the current project cover the century after the earlier process of modernity had folded into the newer one. Now, music during the long 19th century. In addition to empirical study of the existing 19th century sources, it's necessary to interpret these against the backdrop of what had been achieved during the previous era. This can be seen in the status of musical performance and composition of many types and genres on several social strata and encompassing several secular, religious, and mystical forms of music. All of these must be understood also in connection with areas of musical professionalism and amateurism. These, of course, involve specific social relations within the Muslim and the non-Muslim communities, as well as contacts between and among them. On the one hand, the study is aided by the existence of more accessible biographical, official, and community records. But on the other hand, the cultural autonomy of the Ottoman urban society in the musical sphere was fundamentally fractured. Thus, it becomes increasingly difficult to interpret the many rapid changes occurring within the court, the Sufi orders, many of the non-Muslim communities, along with increasingly dominant movements from the West European economies and forms of public art and entertainment. Within the study of music, the 18th century had defined its own modernity, both through the self-consciously modern musical theories of Prince Demetrius Cantemir toward the beginning of the century, up till Abdülbaki Nasırdede at the end of the century. The latter was the first Ottoman writer to characterize the entire makam system according to historical periods, which is an excellent indication of modernity. Prince Cantemir and his contemporary, the Mevlevi Osman Dede, created indigenous notational systems, and Nasır Dede created his own system. Also, now, from the beginning of the 18th century, for the first time, non-Muslim musicians and composers assume a central position in the music of the court. And as we understand now, this process already begins at the end of the 17th century, in the long 18th century. It's mentioned by people as different as Prince Cantemir and Evliya Çelebi. The status of non-Muslim composers, such as Zakaria Efendi, Khacham Moshe, Petros Peloponnesios, Tanburi Isak, or performers such as Kemani Georgi or Kemani Miron, were typical of the 18th century. They have no parallels as a group either in the earlier 17th century or throughout the 19th century. Likewise, for the first time, probably beginning with Mustafa İtri and Petros Bereketis, Ottoman and Neo-Byzantine musical practice shows evidence of what I had termed mutual penetration, and this continues throughout the 18th century. None of these creative endeavors were simple responses to the culture of the West or to any overwhelming political or economic pressure. All of the above also need to be viewed through the lens of Harun Küçük's recent work on the meaning of leisure, rahat, within Ottoman society, as expressed notably in his new book, Science Without Leisure, and our recent joint presentation at NYU on leisure in the Ottoman 18th century. Küçük conceptualizes leisure as a perception of time, a state of being, and as a moral disposition. This concept came to dominate Ottoman culture during the 18th century and was articulated by both Muslim thinkers like Yamyala Esad Efendi and the poet Nabi, and Christians like Nicholas Mavrocordato and Demetrius Cantemir. This contrasted sharply with the previous century, in which all endeavors had to produce immediate, usable results. There was no time for speculation or theory. Likewise, Ilm al-Musiki, the science of music, went into a steep decline until the last third of the 17th century. Compared to the 18th century, the disastrous wars and territorial losses to the Ottoman Empire in the early decades of the 19th century led to a shrinking state income. In general, the early decades of the 19th century and thereafter constituted a period of crisis for Ottoman music. The violent elimination of the Yeniçeri in 1826 and with them the entire Mehter musical ensemble, constituted also a musical crisis for the general Ottoman society. The daily public performances of the Mehter had exposed the entire urban population to high-quality Makam art music. As noted recently by Mehmet Ali Sanlikor, the elimination of the Mehteran also involved the end of the popular urban Mehteri Birun celebratory and dance music ensembles. Despite the political necessity for the move against the Yenicheri, the end of both the official and unofficial Mehter impoverished the musical life of much of the urban population of all the religious communities. On the more folkloric level, the state moves against the Bektashi dervish order associated with the Yenicheri also ended the long tradition of the Samai Kahve, the coffee house of the Janissaries, where Bektashi hymns were performed. This also formed an important cultural link with Turkish Anatolia. The decline in state income was one reason for the disbanding of the prestigious Chengi and Köçek dancing ensembles during the reign of Mahmud II. Many of the dancers and the musicians moved to Egypt, which was experiencing greater prosperity under Muhammad Ali. They were finally banned altogether in 1857 by Sultan Abdülmecid. Although some of their routines were adopted into the Orta Oyunu, popular theater, in the end, their rich, mimetic, and dramatic dance was entirely forgotten and was never properly documented. The improvised urban gypsy dancing that came to replace it could not compare with the subtlety of the earlier choreographic tradition. An economic issue that impoverished the musical life of the Sunni Muslims, in particular, was the musical decline of the major urban Sufi tarikats. This was caused not by any overt move on the part of the state, but rather by economic decline of the urban crafts guilds and many of the Muslim merchants, all of which have been important supporters of the Halveti, Qadiri, and other orders, apart from the Mevlevi. We'll get to it. The major cause seems to have been the large-scale introduction of mass-produced industrial items, mainly coming from the British Empire and elsewhere. Together with the shrinking of the Ottoman borders within Eastern Europe, the competition of Western European traders also limited the movements of the larger Muslim merchants. Saadet and Ergun in the 1940s had already noted the decline in musical production of the tarikats during the 19th century as compared with the 18th. Apart from the initiated dervishes, Istanbul alone had many thousands of muhibs, tarikat followers. Since the later 17th century, some of the leading Sufi and Ottoman composers had been such muhibs, the outstanding examples being Hafiz Post and Nazim Çelebi. The musical muhibs performed an important pedagogic function in spreading knowledge of the Makam music to much of the Muslim urban population. The economic decline of the tarikats therefore led to a coarsening of the musical taste of much of the urban middle and lower middle classes. However, due to their close links with the bureaucracy and even the judiciary, as well as the rich endowments of their tekes in or near Istanbul, the Mevlevi order was able to maintain its economic status and hence its support for music and musical pedagogy. While this was principally among the Muslim population, the Mevlevis were also a major link, spreading high-level ilm al-musiki practices to able secular musicians, as well as church and synagogue cantors. Likewise, members of the Muslim ulama continued to learn secular art music, as their predecessors had in the previous centuries. This had been a long-standing cultural practice of the Ottoman state and cultures. Now I'll go over some rather familiar history briefly. Mahmud II followed his destruction of the Mehterhane with the creation of Musika Humayun, a mixed Western and Turkish military ensemble, under the leadership of Giuseppe Donatelli Pasha. While the sultans of the Tanzimat continued to have an interest in Ottoman music along with Western music, the social conditions did not favor much new creativity within the courtly genres. Indeed, the great composer of the era, Ismail Dede Effendi, left the court and went on Hajj during the reign of Abdul-Majid in 1846, saying that this game has lost its flavor. In 1856, Callisto Guatelli took over the Musicae Humayun. He seems to have developed a deeper interest in Ottoman music and composed many short Makan-tinged compositions, as well as arrangements of sharkas by Sultan Selim III and Mahmud II. He also took over the musical direction of the Naum Theatre, the Théâtre Italien, which had begun in 1844. Until 1870, this theatre provided a professional venue for high-level Italian opera. Apart from visits by reigning sultans and members of the court, it would seem that the audience for these productions were mainly members of the Levantine community and some of the local non-Muslim minorities. And we have heard from Jacob Oli about the operetta, the first Turkish operetta in 1874-75 by Dikran Çuhajian, and the parodies in the press between the Çuhajian and others. This was an enormously successful piece with many performances. Now, the Musicae Humayun developed as a rather hybrid performance institution. The Mevlevi order contributed several major musicians and composers to the official ensemble. The Beşiktaş Mevlevi Hane produced several musicians throughout, creative musicians through the 19th century. And I could name several important musicians from Beşiktaş who ended up in the Musicae Humayun, particularly, let's say, if we look at Salih Dede, became the Nezenbaşı at Bahariye and Kasım Pasha. He did not become sheikh because he was accepted into Musicae Humayun, rose to the rank of Kaymakam. Said Dede's son Yusuf Pasha, considered the most important composer of instrumental music of the 19th century, also underwent his training in Beşiktaş, became a Dede as well as Nezenbaşı. But in 1840, he too joined Musicae Humayun. Quite early, he caught the attention of the new Sultan Abdul-Majid, who became a companion. Later, he was the Ney teacher to Sultan Abdulaziz and reached the rank of Miralay, general. His son Celal was also an officer in Musicae Humayun, learning both Turkish and Western music on the cello. Two of Yusuf Pasha's three daughters, Destine and Vedia, were musicians and became music teachers at the prestigious girls' schools in Istanbul. Another link between the Mevleviya and Musicae Humayun existed in the person of the Armenian Kuyumcu Oskian. In his youth, he had studied tambur with the preeminent tamburi Isak Fresco. Later, he had studied ney with the illustrious Deli Ismail Dede, who had become Nezenbaşı at Galata. Under Sultan Abdülmecid, Oskian was accepted into the Musicae Humayun as a Nezen and composed many peshrevs and sasamais. It is also through Oskian that the distinctive tambur technique of Isak has been transmitted. And I might add that I was privileged to learn this technique from my teacher, Necdet Yaşar, who had it through a line, a silsila, going back directly to Oskian. And he insisted that I learn it. In general, we cannot view the role of Western music in 19th century Istanbul through the lens of the musical policies of the Turkish Republic. Western music had its two strong bases in the court on the one hand and the theater on the other. The bridge between the two eras was the period following the 1908 Constitution and then to the lead up to the First World War. In this period, increasing ties to Germany and Austria led to educational opportunities for younger Turkish musicians in Berlin and Vienna. This eventually produced results in the Republic importing German and Austrian musicians and teachers within the newly founded opera and conservatories, especially in Ankara. Now, thanks to the CMO project and our colleague Jacob Oli, we know a lot more about Hampazin notation and notation in general in this period. And I don't want to repeat too much. The new Armenian notation was based on the earlier Ottoman principles, but using Armenian symbols. it seems to have been appearing around 1813 as Oli has taught us, through a combination of collaboration of four major individuals. Within a relatively short time, musicians were willing to learn the new Armenian symbols as a kind of neutral intercommunal means of musical communication. Even the Mevlevis sometimes wrote shortened versions of the instrumental sections of the ayins and hampazum for purely pedagogic purposes. 15 years later, with the establishment of Musica Humayun, Donizetti Pasha introduced the Western notation for all genres and repertoires. Now, the many contradictions involved are symbolized by the major role of such Mevlevi musicians as Salih Bey and his son Yusuf Pasha. Both were adept at Western notation, but they did not seem to view it as a major tool for their own compositions. Even in the following generation, the outstanding Nezen Aziz Dede would even beat up any of his students found to possess musical notations. Nevertheless, it was his own student, Raouf Yektabe, who eventually succeeded in notating almost the whole of the surviving Mevlevi repertoire. And we know about the later publications of Western notation in Istanbul. And of course, it was still accepted that the oral mesh was the essential pedagogic method. And so it is indeed a mystery for us to understand how and why these commercial notations were used. And of course, as we've learned from Eleni Kalanopoulou, the publication of Neo-Byzantine notations of secular music are in a way a continuation of a process that had begun in the 18th century. So, the extension of this practice also to Ottoman Wallachia and the renewed creativity of Anton Pan in the early 19th century are part of this larger cultural picture. And I might mention the wonderful ensemble Anton Pan by Constantine Raileanu in Bucharest, who has been tracing this link between Istanbul and Bucharest. So we will hear much more about this in this conference. One moment. Please. Now, professional and non-professional. Already by the later 17th century and throughout the 18th, musical professionalism had a very specific social distribution. Until their elimination, perhaps the most clearly professional group were the Mehteran. Some of the musicians, such as the famous Muskale Solakzadeh in the 17th century, could segue themselves into more courtly positions. Apart from the unfree male and female musicians at the court, an increasing number of private musicians were called upon to perform and to compose the courtly repertoire while residing as private citizens. Even such a great court musician as Tamburi Isak did not live at the court. All through the long 18th century, several major courtly performers and composers earned part of their living within one or another bureau or as calligraphers. During this entire period, the role of the Mevlevi musicians, both as musicians but also as tambour players, continued to grow. Toward the other social end were the undoubtedly professional members of the Kochek and Chengi troops. These had once been an influential and sometimes well-paid profession. But in our period, they were gradually replaced by much poorer Gypsy Roma musicians who probably do not occupy much space in any kind of communal records. An added complication is the bifurcation of the Istanbul Roma into Muslim and Orthodox Christian segments. A legacy of the more leisured 18th century, the next period with a still considerable group of Muslim individuals of bureaucratic or aristocratic backgrounds who had inherited a taste for Ottoman music as part of their general culture. Some, but not all of these people may have had muhib status within the Mevlevi or sometimes other tariqat orders, or had traveled in similar social circles. They had inherited the mejlis custom as it had developed since the long 18th century as a sociable but still highly cultured gathering that nurtured young talents by exposing them to the judgments and performances of the more experienced colleagues. Our host, Panos Poulos, has been documenting how these Mejlis gatherings functioned from the end of the Ottoman into the early to mid-Republican periods. At times, individuals who were known as Islamic cantors might be present at such meetings, but much more needs to be uncovered as to the nature of informal gatherings among Christian and Jewish cantors who were also adept in Ottoman secular music. In the case of the Jews, the issue was complicated by the fact that the most talented Hazanim in the more central and larger synagogues sometimes also composed a version of the courtly fasl as the repertoire known as the Maftirim. By the early 19th century, this repertoire was old and widespread enough between Edirne, Istanbul, and Izmir to constitute a corpus which could function as an adequate model for new compositions. I won't say more about Maftirim, which is also a very important subject. Now, about art and entertainment. After the middle of the 19th century, and this was an issue that came up a number of times today. After the middle of the 19th century, the waning influence of the classical fasl at the court led to the creation of a middle-brow version of the concert, which usurped its name, fasl. Especially after 1876, this new form of fasl was performed mainly in the gazinos, in the nightclubs, usually run, as we know, by members of the Greek or Armenian communities. Now, the nightclub fasl was essentially based on a succession of sharka songs of various lengths, usually beginning with the Araksak. So this is, in a sense, starting with the lightest element that was marginal to the fasl of the Ottoman court. And it usually would end with local dances like the Greek Sirto, or some of the imported Romanian gypsy klezmer dances of the Longa genre. And this, by the way, just as a note, visits and performances by this combination of Moldavian klezmer and Moldavian gypsy lautar in Istanbul is an old tradition going back to the 18th century. And we have actually a wonderful description of the combination of these musicians in Istanbul, written in 1839 by the British writer Julia Pardo in her wonderful book, Beauties of the Bosphorus, where she describes the combination of the Wallachian and Jewish troubadours who were entertaining the veiled beauties, Muslim women at one of the open parks in the Anatolian side. And this goes up until the very beginning of the 20th century, where we have a number of what appear to be mixed Moldavian klezmer and perhaps Greek performers who were issued by the Odeon and the Orpheon labels in Istanbul with labels written in Greek characters. We have something like the famous Doina from an orchestra of Goldberg, written in Greek, Kleftiko Vlachiko. And so we would hope that some research into the records of Orpheon and Odeon could tell us more about exactly who were in these bands and which of them might have been local and which of them were coming in from probably Romanian Moldova at this time. Now, at the gazinos, among the mix were musicians with very different backgrounds. And again, it's not quite fair to call this only lower class. There were several distinctions of the gazinos. And they had muezzins, as well as Christian or Muslim Roma, musicians coming from more bureaucratic or even aristocratic backgrounds, like Tamburi Cemil Bey. There's no doubt that much of the musical creativity of that generation was absorbed within the musical culture of the gazino. While Munir Bekend at UCLA has accomplished excellent research into the social structure of the major gazinos of Republic in Istanbul, this current project will offer us many possibilities to deepen our understanding of the life of the gazinos in previous generations. One of the leading composers of the gazinos was the Armenian violinist Tatios Efendi. Tatios also composed instrumental peshrafs as well as sharkas. According to an existing photograph, his ensemble was still relatively conservative, featuring 2 tambours, a violin, and a daive. But later in the 19th century, the newly imported oud quickly took the place of both the tambour and the semi-rural instruments tambura and bozuk. The oud had been displaced from Ottoman urban music along with the now extinct kopuz and sheshhaneh since the later 17th century. And this is a very important point, that my contention is that before we have the dominance of the tambour, we do not have Ottoman music as we know it. Ottoman music is coterminous with the tambour. Now, by the late 19th century, the oud's tonal versatility, its fretless neck, equally at home with urban maqam music or with rural folklore, its rhythmic dynamism, and relatively greater volume rendered it more appropriate in situations where a purely artistic repertoire was not required. Thus, the replacement of the tambour by the oud symbolized the retreat of the InterMusiG artistic repertoire from public spaces into the mejlis of the conoscenti, as well as the Mevlevi harmonies, of course. I will close with saying a few remarks about gender. As can be imagined, gendered musical practices are among the most elusive topics. We might say that the socially higher and socially lower and most public types of female performance are the most accessible. During the previous 18th century, some of the unfree female musicians of the palace attained a reputation, of whom the most eminent was certainly Dilhaya Kalfa. But the patterns of female musicianship in the palace changed fundamentally during the Tanzimat. By the time of Guateli Pasha, several of his royal female students became both performers within the Sarai and also composers. Some of these patterns have continued into the early Republic and have been the subject of research recently by Nejla Atalay. Slightly below this stratum were the careers of the two daughters of Yusuf Pasha mentioned above. The entrance of women from less elite backgrounds into professional musicianship also occurred, but was poorly documented. A striking example is the career of Kevser Hanum, a violin instructor at the Darul Erhan, from its beginnings until the closure of Turkish music there in 1927. While one of her popular Sirto compositions was published in 1912, the famous Nehaven Sirto, or Ronda, almost nothing of her education, her life, or her career has been preserved. At the same time, the transition from the Revolution in 1908 and the Republic, at this time, female performance from the non-Muslim communities appeared even more often in the gazinos. And as we know, especially from Jacob Orley's research, you can see that in the previous generation, probably a lower class of these performers from the Greek, Armenian, and Jewish communities were also present. And of course, by the Republican era, many of these ladies were documented in commercial reports. What is far less accessible are the areas of female performance which were not purely professional. A striking example would be the wedding songs, Cantigas de Boda, of the Istanbul Sephardi community. Much of the music at such weddings was furnished by female performers who earned great respect, but were rarely paid professionals. At times, Jewish male singers occupied this role. They were professional. But much of the vocal repertoire in the Ladino language have been perpetuated and probably created by women. More detailed documentation is available from commercial recordings done in America, such as Victoria Hazan, and scientific recordings and interviews done in Israel with Benvenido Aguada from Chanakkale. And I was privileged to have met her twice, actually, in Tel Aviv. Several other communities possess wedding songs that were predominantly female and usually non-professional. Examples among the Turkish Muslims would be the songs of the Kına Gecesi, of the bride. Thus, the internal female musical practices of all the communities of Istanbul may prove to be the most difficult to access for the period in question here. So to conclude, is to be hoped that the outstanding group of researchers assembled for the current project, utilizing the materials available in a variety of archives in Istanbul and other sources, including literary sources, may be able to provide a somewhat more complete answers to the many sociological and musicological questions posed. In time, all of this material will contribute to fuller understanding of the many changes and developments within the multifaceted musical life of Istanbul. And I think I'll close here.